Hey everyone, welcome back to more malicious compliance HOA Reddit stories. In today's video, 50 cars a day. That's the number of strangers who are cutting through my property because one HOA busybody decided he had the authority to control my land. He argued that historical usage entitled him to disrupt my peace. So I made it my mission to take down the entire HOA board. Let's get straight into it. The first story comes from r/petty revenge and goes by the title HOA. About a decade ago, my wife and I relocated to the suburbs to raise our family. One thing we noticed right away was that the neighborhood had a community pool, but you had to be an HOA member to use it. After we settled in, I reached out to join and was told they weren't taking new members. That caught me off guard since I was essentially handing them free money, but I let it go. Fast forward 3 to 4 years. My wife and I had long forgotten about that whole exchange. She had taken up gardening as a hobby and had gotten quite skilled at it, but our backyard was far too shaded. After several failed attempts back there, we decided to put in a raised bed garden in the front yard instead. We looked into it and confirmed it wasn't against any city ordinance. So I built her one, and honestly, it turned out beautifully. Our front yard looked like something straight out of a magazine, entirely thanks to her green thumb rather than any talent of mine. Neighbors would go out of their way to walk past and admire it, and the local kids loved grabbing berries as they ran around nearby. Sounds ideal, right? Then the calls began. A city inspector started showing up weekly because someone kept filing complaints about our garden. Every single time, we'd ask whether we needed to remove it, whether it was actually illegal, and every single time, the answer was no. Eventually, we got fed up with the whole charade, especially since whoever was behind it refused to approach us directly. So we filed a Freedom of Information Act request to find out who was responsible and confront them face to face. The moment that request went in, we never heard from the city again. The anonymous complaint stopped too. That should have been the end of it, but our mystery complainant just couldn't leave things alone. A couple of weeks later, I got a phone call from what sounded like an older woman. Caller, hello. I'm afraid you're going to need to remove that front yard garden of yours. Me, who is this? Caller, that's not important. It needs to come out immediately. Me, well, if you actually want something done, it kind of does matter. It doesn't violate any city law or regulation, and we're not removing it without a whole lot more information. Caller, it violates HOA rules. You are not permitted to have a front yard garden in this area according to HOA regulations. At that point, it hit me. These were the exact same people who had turned down my membership offer years ago. I happily laid that out for her with a grin on my face. I could practically hear the realization hit her when she understood who she was talking to. Needless to say, the garden is larger today than it's ever been. We even added a couple of kids' playhouses out front, just because we could. Now let's get into the main story, titled HOA Designates My Road as Public. HOA East. Let me paint the picture. A few years back, my grandfather passed away and left me his property, roughly 2 acres of land that had been in the family for 3 generations. He had purchased it back when the entire area was nothing more than farmland and rubber plantations. He built a comfortable home on it, paved a clean driveway from the main highway up to the house, and lived there quietly for decades. Over time, the city crept outward, and what had once been his remote little plot became prime real estate. The hills behind the property were carved up and transformed into an upscale housing development I'll refer to as busybody estates. The kind of neighborhood where driveways are larger than most people's living rooms and every other vehicle is either a Mercedes or a BMW. Here's what made busybody estates interesting from a geographic standpoint. Due to the terrain, the developer had to work with the natural layout of the land. The main entrance to the development wound through a series of narrow, twisting roads that snaked around the hillside. If you were leaving busybody estates during morning rush hour and trying to reach the highway, you were easily looking at a 15 to 20-minute drive just to exit your own neighborhood. One official way in, one official way out, and during peak hours it turned into a complete standstill. My grandfather's private driveway, by contrast, was a straight shot, roughly 300 meters of paved road leading directly to the highway. Anyone cutting through his property instead of using the official busybody estates exit could shave a solid 10 to 15 minutes off their commute every day. When the development was still under construction, the developer had actually approached my grandfather about routing their heavy equipment through his driveway. Cement trucks, dump trucks, heavy machinery. Rather than running all of that through their narrow internal roads, they wanted access through his property. My grandfather was a practical man. He negotiated a monthly fee. The developer agreed without pushing back, and for roughly 18 months, construction vehicles moved through regularly. The developer even had his driveway resurfaced at one point since their trucks were degrading it. When he passed, I inherited the property and moved in. Construction had long been wrapped up by then, and the development was fully occupied. Affluent families, retirees, young professionals who were clearly earning considerably more than I was. The HOA had been up and running, and life in Busybody Estates was ticking along smoothly. For the first few months after I moved in, things were calm. I assumed the residents were using their own entrance and exit like everyone else. Occasionally, a car would slow down near the entrance to my driveway, take a look, and turn around once they saw it was clearly private property. My grandfather had even put up a faded sign near the highway in that red, private road. Then the HOA got a new president. I'll call him Uncle Henry, because that's what the whole neighborhood called him, even though he wasn't actually anyone's uncle. He was one of those retired men who clearly had an excess of free time and a desperate need for something to feel significant about. You know exactly the type. Polo shirt tucked into khaki shorts, clipboard or tablet always in hand, perpetually strolling the neighborhood like he was conducting an official audit. He had essentially crowned himself the unofficial mayor of Busybody Estates, and apparently the actual residents were either too occupied or too indifferent to push back. The first warning sign appeared roughly 2 months after Uncle Henry took the HOA presidency. I began noticing more cars passing through my property in the mornings. Not construction equipment, regular cars, nice cars, the kind that clearly belonged to Busybody Estates residents. Initially, it was just a handful, maybe 5 or 6 in the morning and a few more in the evening. I figured some residents had discovered the shortcut and were sneaking through. Irritating, but not worth starting a conflict over. Then it escalated fast. Within a matter of weeks, my peaceful morning routine was completely shattered. I'd be sitting on the porch with my coffee starting around 7 a.m., and a steady convoy of vehicles would come rolling through, 50, 60 cars on some days. SUVs, sedans, sports cars, even motorcycles. They barreled down my driveway like it was their own personal expressway, many of them going far too fast, kicking up dust and loose debris. Some honked if they felt I was in their path. One driver actually shouted at me for walking my dog too close to his lane. The final straw arrived when I found an official-looking notice in my mailbox. It was printed on Busybody Estates HOA letterhead and signed by Uncle Henry himself. The subject line read, "Notice of Community Access Designation." The body of the letter explained that the HOA board had reviewed historical access patterns and concluded that my driveway constituted a community easement based on its established use during the development phase. I had to read that sentence 3 times to confirm I wasn't imagining things. The letter continued to explain that my driveway had been added to the official Busybody Estates neighborhood map as Exit B, and that residents were being encouraged to use it during peak hours to ease congestion at the main entrance. The letter also thanked me for my ongoing cooperation with the community and reminded me that as a neighbor, I ought to be pleased to contribute to the area's well-being. I was completely stunned. This man had effectively declared my private property a public road without ever asking me. He simply mailed me a letter informing me that my driveway now belonged to the HOA. I started with the reasonable approach. I installed a new private property, no trespassing sign right at the driveway entrance. It was large, bright red, and impossible to overlook. Someone tore it down within 48 hours. I put up another one, this time bolted to a concrete post. Someone spray painted over it. I attempted to speak to residents as they drove through. Most either waved me off or pretended I wasn't there. A few became outright hostile, telling me I was being unreasonable and demanding to know why I wanted to make their lives harder. Eventually, I went straight to Uncle Henry. I found him during his morning rounds in busybody estates, clipboard in hand, inspecting someone's hedges for violations. I approached him calmly and explained that his letter was factually incorrect, that my driveway was private property, and that the traffic needed to stop. His response made my blood boil. He looked at me the way someone looks at a child throwing a fit and said something to the effect of how I was being unnecessarily difficult, that it was for the community, and that I should actually be grateful they were keeping my road in use so it wouldn't fall into disrepair. He genuinely said that, as though he was doing me a favor by allowing 60 vehicles to tear up my driveway every morning. Gaslighting is probably the more accurate word for it. I tried to explain that no easement existed, that the developer's arrangement with my grandfather was specifically for construction vehicles and had ended years prior. And by the way, let me know in the comments what you would have done in OP's position. Personally, I would have gone straight to the police or a lawyer, depending on what made more sense in that situation. OP seems remarkably composed throughout all of this. Either way, drop a comment and let me know if you're still enjoying the HOA stories. Uncle Henry just smiled and said the HOA's legal committee had reviewed the matter and determined that the right-of-way provisions in the original development plans applied to my road. Right then I understood that conversation wasn't going to fix anything. Uncle Henry had made up his mind and had no intention of backing down. He was too committed to being right, too proud of his little exit B solution to acknowledge that he might have made a serious error. So I call my lawyer friend. He's the kind of guy who genuinely lights up over property disputes. Show him a land title, and his eyes go wide like a kid on Christmas morning. I laid out my grandfather's original deed, the development agreement from the construction vehicle period, and Uncle Henry's absurd letter. He spent about 10 minutes going through everything and then started laughing. There was no easement. None. The developer's agreement had explicitly stated temporary construction access with clear start and end dates, an agreement that had been closed out years ago. The right-of-way clause Uncle Henry had apparently leaned on referred to underground utility pipes running beneath part of the property. It had absolutely nothing to do with the surface road. Uncle Henry had either badly misread the documents or had simply invented the easement because he wanted a shortcut and assumed no one would call him on it. My lawyer confirmed I had every legal right to block the road entirely, install a gate, put up barriers, call the police on every trespasser. It really was that straightforward. But I didn't want straightforward. I wanted Uncle Henry to experience the full consequences of his own declaration. The key was to operate entirely within the framework he himself had constructed. Uncle Henry had officially designated my road as a community access point for busybody estates. He had put it in writing, incorporated it into official HOA documentation, and sent letters to residents actively encouraging them to use it. Well, if my road was officially recognized as community infrastructure by the HOA, then the HOA could hardly object to me treating it exactly like community infrastructure. Malicious compliance incoming. I did some research into local regulations governing private roads and third-party use. As it turns out, when a private road is being used by a community or organization, the landowner has the right to charge maintenance fees to offset wear and tear. This is fairly standard practice. It's how private roads in rural areas operate when multiple properties share access. The fee has to be reasonable. It has to go toward actual maintenance costs, and users must be given the choice to pay or not use the road. Simple enough. I settled on a maintenance fee of $10 per entry. Given the cost of asphalt, road repairs, and dust mitigation, I consider that entirely fair. If anything, probably on the low end. Next, I went to the local hardware store and picked up 2 of the heaviest duty industrial speed bumps they stocked. These weren't your standard parking lot variety. These were the kind installed at warehouse loading docks, the sort that will absolutely wreck your day if you attempt to roll over them at anything faster than walking speed. I had them installed approximately 30 meters apart along the driveway. Then I hired 2 university students who were looking for part-time work. I set them up with a small canopy tent, a table, a pair of chairs, and a cooler stocked with drinks. I had a professional-looking sign printed that read, "Private road maintenance fee, $10 per entry. Proceeds applied to road resurfacing and dust mitigation." I also had official-looking invoices printed up, complete with my property address at the top and field for the date, time, license plate number, and amount due. I briefed the students on their role. They were not to block anyone or physically prevent anyone from using a road. Their sole job was to stand there, record the license plate of every Busybody Estates vehicle that came through, and pass the driver an invoice through their window. If anyone asked why they were being charged, the students were to explain that the HOA had officially designated this road as a community access point, and that per the landowner's rights under local regulations, all community usage was subject to a maintenance fee. Day one was complete chaos. Residents pulled up expecting their usual convenient shortcut and were instead greeted by two enormous speed bumps forcing them to crawl, plus two polite university students extending invoices through their car windows. Most refused to pay, which was perfectly fine. The invoices included a note that unpaid fees would accumulate and could be pursued through small claims court if necessary. I had no real intention of dragging anyone to court over $10, but they had no way of knowing that. The speed bumps did the heavy lifting anyway. Even if people brushed off the invoices, there was no ignoring having to reduce their fancy cars to a near stop twice per trip. The entire appeal of the shortcut was the time saved, and suddenly, that time savings was evaporating. Day 2, Uncle Henry arrived. He came flying down the road in his Mercedes, clearly tipped off by a wave of furious residents. He barely decelerated for the first speed bump, and I honestly thought he was going to bottom out the car. By the second bump, he had no choice but to stop completely. One of the students stepped over and calmly handed him an invoice. I was watching the whole scene from my porch, and Uncle Henry climbed out of his car and began shouting about how I was running an illegal toll booth, how I had no authority to charge fees, and how I was disrupting the community. I walked down to meet him, and I brought my lawyer friend along. I called him that morning, figuring Uncle Henry would eventually make an appearance. Uncle Henry demanded I tear out the speed bumps and dismiss the students immediately. He insisted the road was a community easement and that I had no standing to charge for its use. I told him I was genuinely confused. I explained that I had received an official letter from the HOA formally designating my road as a community access point. I said I had reviewed the relevant bylaws and confirmed that any community infrastructure situated on private land requires a maintenance arrangement. Since the HOA had not offered any compensation for the upkeep of the road, I was simply exercising my right to collect fees directly from the users. Uncle Henry's face cycled through roughly 6 different colors. My lawyer stepped in and calmly laid out the legal reality. He presented the original development agreement, clearly showing the temporary construction access language with defined start and end dates. He showed the land title, confirming the road was 100% my private property. He explained that the right-of-way clause Uncle Henry had relied upon referred to underground utilities, not the surface road. And then he pointed out the critical error. By officially declaring my road to be community infrastructure and committing that declaration in writing, both to me and to every Busybody Estates resident, Uncle Henry had actually reinforced my position. The HOA had effectively acknowledged that they were directing use of my road, and I was now using that acknowledgement as the justification for the fees. Uncle Henry attempted to argue that the letter didn't count, that it had merely been a suggestion, that residents weren't obligated to use Exit B. My lawyer pointed out that the letter had explicitly stated the road was designated as an exit and that residents were encouraged to use it, language that implied official HOA endorsement. I watched Uncle Henry's confident composure fall apart in real time. He understood the trap he was in. If he admitted the letter was wrong, he'd have to answer to every resident for sending official correspondence based on something he had never properly verified. If he maintained the letter was correct, he was conceding that the HOA had authorized use of my private road without my permission. He stormed off without paying his $10. The students duly noted his license plate and added it to the invoice log. Over the following days, Busybody Estates apparently descended into full-blown internal warfare. I wasn't there to witness it firsthand, but I got the details from the students and from a handful of residents who actually stopped to chat after paying their fees. The HOA WhatsApp group reportedly became a battleground. Residents were furious at Uncle Henry for telling them Exit B was free and legitimate when it clearly wasn't. Others were furious at those people for being furious at Uncle Henry, arguing they should have verified before assuming they had the right to use someone else's property. One faction formed to push for Uncle Henry's removal from the HOA board. Another formed to defend him. Someone threatened to sue the HOA for misrepresentation. Someone else threatened to sue me for extortion. The best part was that the invoices kept accumulating every single day. A number of residents did pay the $10, either because they genuinely valued the shortcut or because they didn't want outstanding invoices attached to their names. Those payments went into a dedicated account I had set up specifically for road maintenance. Everything I was doing was completely above board. Most residents, however, stopped using the road altogether. Between the speed bumps, the invoices, and the chaos unfolding in the WhatsApp group, Exit B had become far more trouble than it was worth. By the end of the first week, traffic through my property had fallen from 50-plus cars per day down to maybe 3 or 4. But I wasn't finished yet. My lawyer drafted a formal letter to the HOA board. It cited the HOA's own original correspondence, specifically the section acknowledging that over 50 residents had been using my road on a daily basis for approximately 2 months. It then provided a detailed estimate of the road degradation caused by that usage, based on the number of vehicles, their average weight, and current asphalt resurfacing costs in our area. The total came to $3,500. The letter stated that since the HOA had officially designated the road as community infrastructure and actively encouraged residents to use it, the HOA bore responsibility for the damage incurred during that period of unauthorized use. Payment was requested within 30 days, with legal action noted as the consequence of non-payment. I braced for a fight. I expected hostile counter letters, threatened lawsuits, and months of back and forth. Instead, I got silence for about 2 weeks, followed by a very different kind of letter. This one was official HOA correspondence, but it wasn't signed by Uncle Henry. It was signed by the HOA vice president and the treasurer. The letter acknowledged that there had been a miscommunication regarding the status of Exit B. It stated that the board had conducted a thorough review and confirmed that the road was indeed private property with no easement or community access rights. Enclosed was a check for $3,500 drawn from the HOA reserve fund. But that still wasn't the best part. The letter also stated that the HOA would be issuing a correction notice to all Busybody Estates residents, clarifying that Exit B was private property and that any resident who used it without the landowner's explicit permission will be personally liable for trespassing and any associated fees. Apparently, the other board members had run the numbers and concluded that contesting me in court would cost considerably more than $3,500 and would also put Uncle Henry's incompetence on full display in front of every single homeowner, triggering a full-scale revolt at the next HOA election. The smart move was to settle, issue the correction, and hope people moved on. The correction notice was distributed a few days later. I know because I received a copy. It was impeccably worded, layered with passive-aggressive phrasing about how previous communication may have caused confusion and how the board wanted to ensure all residents had a clear understanding of neighborhood access points. It stopped just short of explicitly throwing Uncle Henry under the bus, but the implication was unmistakable. I used the $3,500 to build a gate. Not a cheap one, either. I hired a local contractor who specialized in stonework, and he constructed a proper stone wall on either side of the driveway entrance with a motorized gate in the center. The gate features a keypad, a remote control, and an intercom system. It looks exceptional, and it completely seals off access to my driveway. I also removed the speed bumps, gave university students a generous bonus for their work, and took down a maintenance fee sign. The irony isn't lost on me. Uncle Henry's attempt to convert my driveway into a public road ended up getting me paid to install a private gate. Before his letter, I had a simple private road sign that most people respected. Now I have an actual physical barrier that no one can ignore, funded entirely by the HOA. Uncle Henry stepped down from the HOA presidency in the aftermath. I heard it was framed as a mutual decision between him and the rest of the board. The official explanation was that he wanted more time with his grandchildren. The unofficial version, according to neighborhood gossip, was that enough residents had complained about the Exit B debacle that the other board members asked him to resign before the next election became a referendum on his judgment. The new HOA president hasn't sent me any letters yet. The residents of Busybody Estates now use their official entrance and exit like regular people. Honestly, my grandfather would have found the whole thing hilarious. He always said the most dangerous person in any neighborhood is the one with too much free time and not enough sense. And Uncle Henry proved him exactly right. And hey, if any of you have had neighbors as unhinged as Uncle Henry, share your story in the comments. I'd genuinely love to hear it. Also, let me know where you're watching from today. The next one is a satisfying little petty revenge story titled, I don't want your roof inspection, but I'll happily take your grocery points. So there's a local roofing company with an absolutely aggressive advertising strategy. Flyers on mailboxes. We're in an HOA, which means you're supposed to call in and get approval. Plus posts in Facebook groups, Nextdoor, and unsolicited phone calls. I'm on a do not call list, but I've already received several calls from them. When I asked how they got my number given my DNC status, they hung up on me. My local grocery chain runs a points system tied to their gas pumps. You enter your phone number and earn 10 cents off per gallon for every point you've accumulated through in-store purchases. Points expire after a month, and since I'm often away from home for extended stretches, I sometimes have to stock up heavily on groceries just to accumulate enough points for the gas discount. As you redeem points at the pump, they drain down, and when I first get back home, I'm often sitting on very few points. That was exactly the situation when I returned home 2 weeks ago. And as a funny coincidence, the roofing company had called me that very morning, which is when they hung up on me. On a whim, I looked up their number and punched it into the gas pump. Voila! Suddenly, I had enough points for the gas discount. It's only about $2.50 worth of points, but they're now effectively subsidizing my fill-up. I have no patience for aggressive, unsolicited advertising, and now, apparently, neither does my gas bill. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you again tomorrow.